Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting stream tonight. Of course, we have our host, Wade Fransson, who I'll introduce. Wade Fransson's life journey has taken him all over the world and provided him with a compelling philosophical and spiritual insight. After a troubled childhood involving divorce, domestic kidnapping, and an international custody battle, Wade joined and later became a minister in the Worldwide Church of God. He shared this in his stirring autobiographical story across the volumes, The People of the Sign and The Hardness of the Heart. Hard-fought answers to thorny biblical questions prompted the mind-expanding and satisfying conclusion to his trilogy, The Rod of Iron. After leaving the ministry, Wade earned an MBA, held significant roles in noteworthy companies, and founded Something or Other Publishing, and founded through which Wade continues to pursue his deep interest in how biblical principles and prophecies can shed light on society's challenges. Wade currently lives in Brooklyn, Wisconsin, with his wife and their 2 children. Also with us tonight is Daniel Sanderson. Daniel is the founder and CEO of Planksip, which has a registered Canadian trademark describing a methodology of promoting and propagating thought concepts and intellectual property for nonfiction authors and academics. As a science and philosophy writer, Daniel is an active blogger, author, and father of 2 living in downtown Vancouver. As self-described flaneur, and pardon my pronunciation there, Daniel draws inspiration for his epistemological schema on topics related to Newtonian giants, artificial intelligence, free will, philosophy, psychology, mathematics, and quantum physics. Phrases like driven by data and propagated through the praxis of Planksip summarize his modus operandi of truth supported by evidence and evolution. So with those introductions, I welcome you two to the stage.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Daniel, I could not be happier that you have graciously accepted the invitation to join me for the inauguration of a new, improved version of the live stream formerly known as Exploring the Bible. We've upgraded and updated it to be created in the image of God, the role of religion in society. And having somebody with the credentials that you have and the approach that you have, and a self-declared, I'm going to say bias, just like I self-declare my bias frequently, so that we have 2 different biases, if you will, 2 different ways of looking at the world. And I believe that that's going to make for an interesting launch to this new approach in this live stream that I'm doing, exploring the role of religion in society. Religious thought, religion and philosophy are in some ways connected. So I really, really am excited to have you join me here in the studio. Daniel, if I may just start by asking, without having you give away any passwords, could you tell me where you are from? You know, city of birth being a typical password hint clue, right?
Yeah, I'm an Alberta boy, so there's no hiding that. I'm an Alberta born, and now I live on the Pacific Coast. I live on Vancouver Island, in fact. So yeah, on the west coast of Canada.
So my mother actually was born in Edmonton, and I was born out in Vancouver. And I've got a good friend that lives on Vancouver Island, Eric Harper. He's a musician out there. I'll have to connect the 2 of you if I haven't already. Next quick question. Do you recall, we've known each other for about a year, or is it longer than that now?
It feels like longer than that, but I think like a nice feeling, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know we came across because of the intersection of Planksip and Something or Other Publishing and different publishing models and whatnot, and you actually gave me some assistance in what I'll call a pre-evolutionary prior species of this podcast that I had you host for me on Planksip, as I was beginning to try to figure out how to address the society around me. from my very unique and not always understood and not generally appreciated by those who are not fans of fundamentalist religion. And in fact, probably I don't have too many fans among fundamentalist religion either, because while I claim to be a fundamentalist, I have perhaps a different definition than generally is understood under that term. And those who are not willing and able to incorporate scientific thought and inquiry and evidence-based conclusions into their philosophical framework would probably consider me, a raving heretic. So my interest is the pursuit of truth and its practical application in human society, whether it be at the family level, the tribal level, the city level, the state level, the international government level, or the entire planet, right? How should we be as a species? How should we behave as individuals? And I know that you have similar interests, but could you just do justice to your bio, which Alex so ably read? But there's a lot packed into that little seed of who and what you are and how you view and approach the world. I'm wondering if you might share with our listeners a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the idea of Planksip as a publishing entity was really coming at it from the standpoint of a philosopher first. And I mean, there's no special flag that I have to wave there, other than the fact that there's a love of wisdom. And I think, Wade, that's where we converge. So it doesn't really hold a lot of weight for me whether there's a fundamental or non-fundamental position with yourself. I just enjoyed our conversations, and effectively that's the starting point that I wanted to have with anybody that was involved with Planksip, whether it was an author, a fellow academic, or thought leader. And I do use those two words interchangeably because I don't think thought leadership actually has to emerge out of a university. I think the pursuit of truth and wisdom is all around us. We just have to be willing, able, and capable of noticing it when we see it. My approach with Planksip was a little bit different. As I mentioned, I came at this as a philosopher first and a marketer second, and that journey for me started back in 2016. I had sold a company that I had grown in the architectural industry, and decided to get into publishing and into philosophy. So I've had my work cut out for me, for sure.
So that's interesting. I didn't know that you were involved in the architectural realm. I've sometimes fancied that I'm some kind of homegrown theoretical architect. I like to imagine constructs and to look at the world through frameworks, and then but more importantly, to test those frameworks against reality. And so I'm now intrigued to know a little bit more about the architectural, the involvement in the world of architecture, because that's very much grounded in reality, right? The whatever an architect constructs, when that building is built or when that thing is created, it either works or it doesn't, right? Philosophy can be kind of an empty study, a noodling, right? A navel-gazing exercise to a degree. At least from my perspective, what's interesting is to test the ideas in the real world and to see if they have merit, because you mentioned evidence-based. So this is kind of a swirly question, but how do you approach evidence-based use of philosophy?
Oh, okay. Well, Wade, my good friend, you really go after the difficult question, but we
it's what interests me.
Yeah, and errors were converging again and very fast, so we're getting into very deep waters. So I have something called a structured ontological framework, and it sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? But let's take, for example, the Platonic dialogues, which I've returned to again and again, and I think it's a common point for all of Western philosophers. And if anybody has, which I can imagine anyone listening to this is going to have a background in theology, as you do. The foundation, Plato has an influence. I mean, that's what we can all agree with that. And so I approach.
Well, not all fundamentalists would agree with you, but yes, I absolutely agree with you. They would deny, right? They would deny that Plato had any influence on their framework because he was a pagan Greek philosopher, right? Therefore, according to their framework, likely opposed to God in the Bible. But anyway, that's just my overlay commentary. I'm in agreement with you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's for me. I mean, it's interesting. So yeah, let's go back. Let's go back a couple steps and say what we know as religion didn't emerge. Christianity didn't emerge until the Greeks gave us the Western culture. So it always makes me scratch my head to
depending on what you mean, depending on how you define Christianity. Again, I would agree with you.
Okay. So I guess from the hints, we're not going to get caught in the weeds here, right? But
right.
And that's in no way negative at all. I just, I mean, yeah, wherever our starting point is. So
one more point. I have in my background learned several languages, and I always have an interpreter's hat on. I want to make sure that the audience, such as we have, is able to follow along, and I'm just following you, but making sure that interpretation is happening to a degree. It may be irritating. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Actually, I quite enjoy that. Actually, it shows that you're paying attention. But I want to assure you and all the listeners that it actually doesn't matter for the point that I'm trying to make.
Great.
And that was this idea of a structured ontological framework. Okay, and this is so effectively you and I have a starting point looking backwards and trying to inform an interpretation of the world and our surroundings, right? And as you mentioned, you continually revise and test those hypotheses. Plural, whatever that is. But anyway, so we approach it that way. Now, the structured ontological framework, when I look at the dialogues from Plato in ancient Greece, I try to come at that with as little bias as possible, or with separated bias.
Right.
And I try
and that term.
Yes, I try and do that so that I can observe, so that I can, as closely as possible, observe, or to use a theological concept, bear witness to the emergent phenomenon that emerges from within.
Let me put a pin in that and make one more of these interpretive or translation comments, and that is with your focus on both the quantum physics world and free will, right? This is really important, right? Because at the quantum level, as we know, the observer can pollute the experiment. And so this idea of separated bias, right? It's critical, is it not?
Oh, Wade, you're
not that we'll ever achieve it, but isn't it necessary to make progress in the deepest, thorniest problems?
I something needs to be said on this, and I have a very, very unique position on this. I don't follow the same line on quantum physics that you're describing.
Okay.
I have a genuine intuition, I would say, that says that we're at a point in scientific discovery where the reality of a probabilistic interpretation of quantum physics is still incomplete. I feel that as time unfolds, we will move more towards the intuition that Einstein had presented, that God does not play dice in the way that's described within the quantum physics world. Okay. Now, I don't really want to go into it too much because
let's you and I pursue that later.
Yeah. Okay.
I was merely trying to underscore the value of what you're describing for anyone is that as you get into philosophy and theory, right, recognizing that one has a bias and making sure that one accounts for that in some way, to perhaps present a further hypothesis at some future point to determine whether or not the bias that went into it led to a conclusion that was perhaps deviant from reality. I don't know. But I'll stop trying to guide your conversation away. I'm not trying to guide it away from where you want to go. I'm actually very interested in hearing where you're going. I just want to. I really do want to make sure that I and the listener understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say we could spend the balance of the hour talking about quantum physics,
Right.
And I think you touched on something that was very interesting in regards to free will, and this ability to choose. That would be something I'd be interested in talking about. I think the conscious apparatus or the experience that we immerse ourselves in is something worth discussing further.
Yes, definitely. Maybe not right now. I want you to continue on your path to Plato. But yes, let's circle back on that either tonight or at a future show.
All right. So the structured ontological framework, essentially, in order for me to extract value and learning from text, I found, and maybe it was more of a learning method, I had a difficulty in just sitting down and reading the 35 books. Right? I'm a very Platonic thinker, actually. So what that means is that I use my imagination a lot. I think and I try to create. And so what the ontological framework does is it allows me to have a framework that I can refer back to and that I can refer other people to. And so effectively what I'm trying to do as a philosopher is try to map subjectivity and creativity in a framework that somebody else can understand and recreate. So that's effectively the reason why I approach text in the way I do. It's a creative and destructive process.
So out of that creation and destruction, what do you derive, for example? Again, in terms of evidence-based conclusions.
Well, first and foremost, I derive meaning in a hierarchy of goodness, and then the nature of that in terms of evidence-based. The two, my intuition wasn't really to bring evidence-based derivations into that. I think as a society we focus a lot on maybe we're preoccupied with evidence, experience, or imagined descriptions. These are not evidence-based experiences, right? So although I emphasize it in my bio, I think that effectively the tradition of ancient Greece and what it gave Western society is a description of what abstract thought is, and that's what I think ultimately Plato's project was. Why it's so beautiful, right, is because it's anchored in and impregnated, to use a Socratic term, it's impregnated in a value system. It's impregnated in an ethic, and it's the cultivation of the virtues that bring this deliverance to the forefront. And I think that's a wondrous that's a wondrous experience and description to behold. So much so that I think the rather contemporary philosophers that we study in university from Rene Descartes onward, who's been labeled as the father of modern philosophy, and so then Descartes and Kant. And I think one thing that it lacks is this ability to look at something from the good. And I think that's the bridge between the good and God. And I think that the understanding of those. Mm-hmm.
Now, let me jump in on that and tie in a couple of things that you just said. So one thing that comes to my mind is, speaking of the good, speaking of God, Jesus' statement that the kingdom of God is like leaven, right? So when you talked about impregnated into, right, immediately leaven came to mind, right?
Mm.
You know, and by the way, we're going to get into this idea about impregnation, because one of the things we want to talk about, going back to beginnings and foundations, is what's going on in this country right now as a result of a recent Supreme Court decision that is leading to a lot of discussion about rewriting the American Constitution and the need to do so, right? The need to restructure and reimagine the project that is the United States of America today, right? These things actually do tie together, even though they seem like widely divergent right now. But the kingdom of God being leavened, so that the spiritual virtue that Jesus brought was to impregnate human society. And there is this debate around whether religion emerges from society or whether religion creates society, going back to, you know, the oldest archaeological expeditions and what they've uncovered. And there are those who have claimed that we have turned this on its head now, and that Göbekli Tepe in, I believe it's in southern Arabia, proves, right, that religion drove the creation of society rather than it emerging from society. So let's get back to what you were saying about the impregnation. I believe you said it was Socrates who used that term. Can you unpack that a little bit more, what he was getting at for me and for our audience?
Well, the process was really through the dialogues, and as most listeners probably know, or maybe they don't, he never wrote down anything. He was the imagined ideal of Plato, at least in the written form that was left to us. But Socrates described himself as a midwife. Midwife for conversation and for philosophy. So it was about giving birth to the idea, to the ideas, and effectively he thought that, Plato thought, and so did Socrates, pretty much, that there was this realm of ideas that we would pull from. Now, I think that kind of concept is kind of ridiculed a little bit, but effectively the heuristic and like this mental little reminder that you have to think of yourself, you have to think of when you're trying to understand the value of that, it's that there's an intuitive aspect to what we already know to be true. It's a matter of trying to connect with what we already know is true. And so that process is something that that Socrates feels that he can assist with that birthing process of the idea. Yeah.
Let me piggyback on that now to twist this and expand a little bit in a different direction. So one reason I have Alex always go through my bio is because my learning has been very experiential, and I will refer to how I arrived at a conclusion based on certain life's events. So as a child, I was kidnapped in a domestic kidnapping, and it led to an international court battle that went to the Supreme Court of Sweden. And that led to me being transplanted in Sweden for a while and learning about the socialist system. And I grew up on these epic Olympic and hockey battles between Canada, where I was born, the United States, where I had been, Sweden, where I, was now living, and of course the Soviet Union, right? And these epic battles were very influential to me as a child. These competing, and it was very ideological. Anyone who's ever seen that movie, the Red, what's it called? The one about the Russian hockey team. It's the Red something. Anyway, it talks about how the ideology of the Soviet Union was wrapped up in their sports programs because they were trying to assert the superiority, the exceptionalism, right, of the Soviet Empire versus the exceptionalism of the United States. And of course, Canada was in there, Sweden, sort of the humanitarian superpower is what Sweden was called. So these ideas were swirling around in my head as a young child. And later, I actually got to travel to the Soviet Union after I studied Russia. And that was when I had one of my first biggest epiphanies. And it was at the time Gorbachev was being abducted. And I was coming in through Finland, and you may have heard me tell this story, into Leningrad at the time, St. Petersburg now. And the streets were deserted because there were tanks coming from Moscow to put down the rebellion. And Yeltsin was there, right? And the Soviet army laid down their arms because they said, we are not going to open fire on our own citizens again at that time. And in that very pressure chamber of Leningrad, and I was working with Radio TV Leningrad at the time, these young Western-oriented individuals, we were having these very spirited conversations, and it was at that moment, I won't go into the detail, but it was at that moment that I realized that the one thing we all have in common across this diverse planet and these differing ideologies, right? You talked about Socrates and the ideas that we can pull from to confirm whether or not what we believe is true. And usually we are seeking confirmation that what we believe is true. What the epiphany that I got was that what we all have in common as human beings, regardless of our vast diversity of characteristics and ideas, is that we all know we're right. Every person knows they are right. And the hardest thing is to change somebody's mind. David Byrne, Talking Heads, wrote this great song off of Fear of Music called Mind. I need something to change your mind. Drugs won't change you. Religion won't change you. Science won't change you. What's the matter with you? I need something to change your mind. That's so difficult because everybody knows they're right, right? So I'd like you to sort of take that input now and talk a little bit more about this birthing of ideas, the I forget what you called it, the storehouse of ideas that can be drawn from, and why that's ridiculed. What's your take on everything that I've just shared here in light of what you're describing?
Well, I'm with compassion for that approach, and the word that comes into my mind is pluralism, and it's a term that is used as a pejorative of sorts, at least in a political arena. But pluralism from a diverse group of perspectives is really interesting, and I think we could make a statement to say that as a human species, we are nothing more than the cultivation, I guess, just to help me get through that, the cultivation of all of those ideas that have come before us. Like, we're not a cultivation of ideas that we haven't experienced before, right? There may be ideas that we can discover, but for example, when it comes to political systems, well, we can only describe and enact and live and learn from things that we've actually defined. Some of them may be good, some of them may be bad, but we can't actually experience something that we haven't described before. And so in some respect, it means that they all have special place. They all have some sort of value in history. They all have some relevance, right? Now, even if they're just relevant from the standpoint of contradicting a downward slide. So for example, Nazi Germany, right? I mean, what kind of a society are we now because of the state of Nazi Germany? Had Nazi Germany not existed and any other extreme fascist or extreme societies taken shape and destroyed us destroyed populations on a mass scale, such as in the earliest 20th century, 21st century, and 20th century, sorry, what would our reality be? It's an odd thing to imagine, but the very fact that it actually happened.
I'm with you. Absolutely, I'm with you absolutely on this.
So the one point I want to make, to bring it back to a chosen people, would be the Jewish state of Israel. That gift was really a response to those atrocities, and has forever changed the Jewish population. Right, and so that's the point. I'm not even making an ethical claim of whether it's right or
and
wrong.
Let me throw a couple of bones to the audience right now on all this. Right, one is, and I'm going to get into hot water now when I say this, but since you raised this potential point, I'm going to make it right, and that is that throughout thousands of years of Jewish persecution. And there are prophetic statements around the fact that the Jews would suffer for 2,520 years. This goes back to the book of Leviticus in the Bible. 7 times 7, and then you interpret that through various prophetic counting sequences. And yet they toasted at Passover next year in Jerusalem. But when the opportunity came to actually do that, many chose not to. Think of the movie The Fiddler on the Roof. And at that time, it was possible to emigrate to Israel, which had been the dream of Jews for centuries. But it could be said that they stayed away in droves despite this annual Passover celebration and this ritual of saying next year in Jerusalem. But to your point, it did happen after the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so yes, the darkest moments, it's often darkest before dawn. And so to just take the evolution of that people, just forget about the Bible, just the evolution of that people, right? And so further, some of the things you've mentioned, there is an evolution of human society, right? And just like anything else in what I call creation, or what anyone else would call the universe, there are these fractals upon which things are built, right? And there are rules and laws, and you're a mathematician as well, I heard from your bio, so you would understand the mathematical patterns that exist. And so throughout human experience, society continues to evolve, and we could say progress, right? Though it sometimes seems like we're not progressing. And the different viewpoints and perspectives would call out this thing as being anything but progress, or that thing as being anything but progress. And thus it is with the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. Some are hailing it as progress, and others are recoiling in horror at the retrenchment, right? And so back to this again, and I'm not trying to overuse the term evidence-based, but in terms of philosophical frameworks and ontological constructs, how and when do we know that we're moving forward versus taking a step backward? What could we have known? What could the citizens of Germany have known about what Hitler was doing and where he was going? What could have helped learn that lesson in a little bit less painful way, if anything?
Well, my intuition is to say that I'd always like to see us return to the cultivation of virtues, and I think that you, me, my children, your children, our society should always be able to reflect and take inventory on where we're at, individually in terms of the cultivation of those virtues.
So then let me ask it a little bit differently, very more practical, tactical. How does one define what is a virtue versus what is a vice?
Well, again, I'd go to ancient Greece in that respect. And the highest of virtue is the concept of good. But you're going to ask questions like, what is justice? What is love? What is courage? All of those types of things are really important questions to ask. And I think that I think that's the approach. It's returning to a virtue-based society. And if we want to spend a little bit of time on the question of Roe versus Wade, the abortion issue, that's a tough one to dissect. I think the first point is to come at it from an understanding standpoint. So let me see if I can encapsulate both sides. The one side is a woman's right to choose, which my intuition points in that direction. And the other approach is to say that more of a conservative religious position, which, if I'm trying to put my best interpretive hat on that position from a religious standpoint, it's that we're on slippery ground. And so when we open up those kinds of doors to not protecting the sanctity of life and the future generations, we're on a downward slide as a society, right? I mean, it's the very starting point of the continuation of our species, and we cannot contaminate it with relatively arbitrary decisions. And remember, from a religious standpoint, one of the first things a religious conversation will ask is, do you believe in something bigger than yourself? Meaning that, bringing this back to an abortion issue, you say, well, as that woman, do you believe that this is not entirely your decision and that you're part of a greater good? And do you commit yourself into that society in a way that is going to make society a better place? So I think, in all fairness, the conversation kind of gets polluted on both sides. And it's kind of a shame, because when there's abrasions on both sides, there's real failure. And when failure happens, violence and anger emerges. And that, bringing back to the point, it does nothing to cultivate virtue.
Absolutely. Let me interject a couple of thoughts at this point. First of all, I wasn't remotely wanting to put you on the spot to come down on one side or the other, and I really appreciate how you just addressed it. In fact, the issue wasn't even really to discuss abortion per se, but rather how this Supreme Court decision is causing a broader discussion in society. But that gets back to the idea of impregnation, right? This question and the decision of the highest court in this land is impregnating an important discussion, right? So one other input is it's been said that the virtues are the golden thread that run through all religions, right? And so hopefully that's true. And yet, like anything, like any idea, like any good, right? Or even a virtue taken to excess, in a sense, could become a vice, if you know what I mean. And that's probably not true at some, more clear philosophical level. But if you only focus on one virtue, it could become so imbalanced that it actually becomes a negative, right? So, the virtue of forgiveness, if it is exclusively applied without the virtue of justice, right? Um, my take on that, for example, is that the individual must forgive, but society must mete out justice. For example, that's just one way to look at it. But my point is that this question, as you framed it, of the two different sides, right? Would you not agree that we're teasing out important questions that have not fully been addressed as a society, right? As we populate the entire planet, and our societies and our systems become ever more complicated and interwoven. There's more opportunity for advancing inquiry into some of these questions, right? Those two different perspectives, the right of a woman to choose, or to not have society impose its value and its interpretation on a decision that is so critical to her life and to her future and to her own body, while at the same time the need to take into account the greater impact of one's own decisions.
I want to think there was a question there, but the
question is: are we not, in terms of evolution, are we not at a point of addressing this question in a more complete and comprehensive way than was done 40, 50 years ago, whenever it was that Roe v. Wade was established as law?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I mean, my comments on it are, in any time we're going to talk about, it is helpful to separate cultural evolution from evolution, right? Biological evolution. And it's almost like socially, the two are not really compatible, right? And so actually, that's a nice, little connection between a religious refusal of evolution, because we can't have the conversation from a biological standpoint through conversation to say that we're affecting any sort of evolution. Now, there's some exception, like lactating populations. We're able to see that there's some biological or evolutionary changes that are happening, but the scale in which evolution happens, Wade, takes just an enormous amount of time and a tremendous amount of deaths, births, and renewals, right? Which, could be, pointing to a reincarnation story as a representation of Jesus himself on the largest, grandest scale that we can't even imagine.
Well, Jesus himself said he would return, right? I mean,
well, of course, he's kind of the incarnation of the birth and renewal. It's
right. And by the way, I am not a denier of evolution in any sense of the word.
No. And yeah. The reason why I brought it up in that particular way is because it's very important to say, if we're talking about the evolution of society morally or culturally, that's a kind of a completely different thing. And one thing I would really like the listeners to understand is that is a question at the forefront of the scientific community right now. This is the difference. This is the reason why thinkers like E.O. Wilson, who passed away in 2001, an evangelical participant, I guess. I don't know what his official designation was or anything like that, but he was one of the most influential leading biologists that this century has ever produced, and a remarkable man. And when I think about the questions that he brought up with Charles Lumsden in as early as 1974, trying to discuss and uncover the basis of cultural evolution, it's still it's a very, very important question right now, as to, is there something that is pulling us through effectively, as Brett Weinstein would say, some sort of like scientific evidence-based reason, I guess, or evidence for religion, the tendency for religious evolution and cultural evolution. This is a very, very important question, right? And so I think it's important for people who have a theological background, to maybe look at some of these people and think about what science is doing to try and form a consilience between these two parties, right? Very enlightening, I think.
Well, this is maybe a good point to introduce to the audience and to this show. When I created the new title, Created in the Image of God, exploring the role of religion in society, the alternate tagline that I had was pursuing intellectual coherence and spiritual commitment. And to me, that intellectual coherence must come first, because if it's intellectually incoherent, how can you be spiritually committed to it? Because to deny logic and coherence, to me, it violates the very principle of religion. And in particularly religion, depending on how we define it, is the role of religion. To me, the role of religion in society is to provide coherence, to provide some sense of agreement, so that we as a species can move in a direction together, right? Versus war, versus destroying each other, versus killing each other in opposition to one another, right? Now, we may then, like a school of fish, swerve this way for a while and then have to swerve that way for a while, but at least we are acting in some kind of unison in order to test whatever relevant philosophical framework or new idea, right? Because if we're just contending about it and trying to prove each other wrong by proving ourselves right, I don't believe that is the best path for evolution. There are evolutionary factors, right? The survival of the fittest, right? As a slogan, a soundbite.
I have to interject because you just throw me for a loop when you use the evolution so interchangeably. But like this survival of the fittest, it's really not a helpful thing, because it's we could just say cultural evolution. That's what we have control of. That's what we as a society can shape and influence. We really, we have no ability unless we're actually affecting, like through some sort of genetic manipulation. We don't really have an ability to affect evolution per se, long-term evolution, right? That's something that just is in the hands of, whatever you want to.
Some species do die out.
Oh no, that's very natural. I mean, and to bring up a point with E.O. Wilson, he studied ants. They call him the Ant Man, and I believe there's something like 10,000 species, right? And I don't know. It sounds kind of perverse to chuckle at this, but with a coming apocalypse or climate collapse, that we read about and that we're all concerned about. You look at a species like an ant, like the ants, and there's 10,000 of them, right? Like we've got one species,
right?
That's it, right? Maybe a chosen, maybe a chosen society or people, right? I mean, depending on who you talk to, but you have this. If it's a survival of the most adaptive, they have 10,000 chances. We have one, right? So whatever's in our nature, I hope to God he got it right, because there's a high probability chance that it's not going to turn out that way.
This allows me to repeat some of my favorite framework ideas for this program, and that is that the first two commandments that God gave in the creation story were, number one, dress and keep the garden. And this he gave to Adam before Eve was created. And then there's the whole story of naming the animals to find a helper for him. A helper in what way? In what sense? A helper? Well, to fulfill the commandment of dressing and keeping the garden. And then there was no helper found. And lo and behold, the helper that was found was also the one that could help him fulfill the next commandment, which was to be fruitful and multiply. And there you have this cone of be fruitful and multiply. And I'm sorry if I'm using this interchangeably, but in an evolutionary sense, man became the most invasive species the planet has ever known. So the be fruitful and multiply commandment was fulfilled with extraordinary passion and zeal, religious fervor, to obey that commandment at the expense of the previous commandment. And we thus lurch forward from ditch to ditch from the dawning of creation. And the two books that God gave us, the handbooks, the operating manuals, if you will, as a species, were one, the revelation, the revealed word. And I wanted to circle back on this, and this may be for a future discussion, if you're, willing to come back on the show, which I would just absolutely love to have you, in a series of these as we dig into some of these topics. But you talked very early on about the inability to comprehend anything without, and these weren't your words, but something, the language, the concepts, the ideas that have to be built upon, and without them. So if there's this creator, whatever revelation he gave was limited to the comprehension, the language, the concepts, the experience available to the recipients of that revelation at that time. So it is completely and totally unfair to judge the Bible by the standard of, well, it's a divine God and it should be this and this. No, God limited himself to the comprehension capability of the species at the time of which he was talking and communicating to it. But that's one book. The other one is the creation itself, and thus it's science. Just as humankind was beginning to learn to comprehend the message of a divine being in the form of revelation, we are only at the very beginning of being able to read the book of creation, right? And is that not what science, the project of science is to read the book of creation? Didn't Einstein say he wanted to know God's thoughts? And the rest were details. But the devil's in the details, and you have to dig into the details in order to comprehend any kind of underlying reality. Now, I've gone way off on several tangents, and I've kind of lost the train of thought here. But it had to do with the species and the ants and the 10,000 of them, and some of them will survive, right? But the one human species may not, and let's hope that God got it right. Well, he gave us freedom of choice way back when. The jury's still out on how that's going to end up.
Yeah, I maybe I can pull it together a little bit with I think we could look at it from a standpoint. And you tell me if this resonates with you. You've got quite a theological background, so you have an Abrahamic religion that really wants society to go and multiply. Really, I mean, I can understand why that is beneficial for society, right? In terms of spreading Christianity through kin-based memes and this type of thing, right?
Well, it predates Christianity by a few thousand years, right?
Well,
but anyway,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my point was only to say that from a Christian standpoint, it does make sense in order to propagate the religion, especially when you look at the emergence of Christianity, right? You look at it and say, well, yeah, we would like to see more households, we'd like to see more Christians come from the birth of existing Christians, right? And we'd like to have that information transferred down from father to son and then proselytized and spread throughout communities.
Getting back to Abraham, the promises were made to Abraham in the context of, I know you will teach your children. That's part of that covenant.
Right, and I think there's an aspect of earlier civilizations where we really needed increases in populations, right? Now, the question that I want to pose to you and have the audience think about is that right now we're at 8.9 billion people, okay? Now, assuming that I'm not going to get a much of pushback on the reality of a climate catastrophe and the potential for collapse, let's just assume that is the case. what does that tell us about the not just millions, but billions of people that will suffer and die coming into the future?
Well, you should not get any pushback because, as we've just stated, the first commandment was dress and keep the garden, and the second one was in the context of the first. One of the principles that I want to get out to the audience is that this, tossing out of babies with bathwater, right, that we so joyfully engage in as human beings, is extremely dangerous, right? And to your point, we must build on the ideas and that which came before, right? There was never an intent that humankind should just continue to go on and multiply. That is just not in the Bible at all, and therefore, no Bible thumping Christian should deny that climate awareness and that the impact of our species on the climate should not be a topic of intense interest and discussion. But in fairness to some of those people, these things are all politicized as well, which causes a reaction and causes a desire to deny because of the way in which it's being turned into a weapon and a club. Mm-hmm. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
That is a difficult one. It's a difficult. I almost wish that the conservative fundamentalist position was actually one and the same. To use a Latin word, sui generis, with biodiversity, and without it being some sort of like one with nature thing. I think the idea of cultivation, trying to understand that we're part of a bigger whole, and then that includes our nature, right? Our Mother Nature, and I wish that more religion would actually emphasize that as a conservative fundamental position, and then I think that would diffuse the club that you're talking about that is weaponized by I guess what critics would call the push for a godless new world order, right? I mean,
right. And these clubs exist on both sides. I'm not here to defend either side. That's the point. Everybody believes they're right, and they're trying to weaponize something to beat the other side into submission. And if they won't, then just destroy them. Right. I'm gonna just read a couple of comments here as we conclude today. Jafar writes, "Are the secular laws like don't murder and don't steal just religious teachings that have been so agreed on for so long that we all just take them for granted?" And this might be something we explore in a future study, is which came first, the chicken and the egg, and that whole thing that was teed up. A.M. Sterling 1, perhaps this one species, I like this comment, perhaps this one species, man, has the combined capacity of the 10,000 species of ants. In that light, I believe in our chances in the long run.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
So, Daniel, you and I could probably just keep going, and we're at time, and we didn't even really get to jump into the NPR podcast that I wanted to. I'll tee it up for our listeners with just a quick teaser soundbite of the first few seconds, and I hope that you'll be able to join us maybe even next week to dig into the actual podcast. But I think this sort of discussion was really important foundational grounding for the dialogue that I hope you and I will be able to continue along with other guests that we'll be inviting to this show. So give me a moment here to just quickly share this stop screen. Oh, was I share? I wasn't sharing the screen all along, I hope. Anyway, so let's say share screen. I'm a highly evolved person, but technology still gets the best of me. So select the tab. There we go. Ugh. I accidentally hit cancel instead of share. One more time. So we'll just play the first few seconds of this to tee up a future discussion.
The Supreme Court's term has ended, and Democrats are still responding to one of its most controversial rulings. President Biden said he would support an exception to the filibuster rule in order to codify Roe v. Wade into law. His statement comes in the wake of lawsuits from activists in a half dozen states, all challenging different legal aspects of trigger abortion bans. At least 13 states have so-called trigger laws in place. We're diving into that today as part of our Remaking America project. Over the next 2 years, we'll collaborate with public radio stations across the country to ask how our democracy is working and how it isn't. I'm Celeste.
So the teaser there, the red meat, right, to get people interested and engaged in this is that phrase, remaking America, right? Remaking America in whose image? So the title of this live stream show, Created in the Image of God, Exploring the Role of Religion in Society. We have a national debate going on in the United States. I'm here with Daniel Sanderson from our neighbor to the north, where I also was born. I was an underachiever because as an American, I knew I could never become president, not having been born here. But Daniel and I, two people who were born in Canada, are tackling tonight sort of the underpinnings. Daniel, you spoke a lot about ancient Greece and its impact, right? So the American Constitution and the American project has had an enormous influence, an outsized influence on the planet over the last several hundred years. And now there are those who are proposing to remake America, and the United States of America, which in certain iconic phraseology that is part of the American identity, we have this one nation under God concept. And the question that many have is this remaking, what will it be like? What will happen when we start tinkering with and trying to change the fundamental constitution of the United States of America? And you have people on all sides of this issue up in arms. My point in bringing this up is we should be talking to each other. We should not be in our echo chambers. We should not be advocating for one side to the point of weaponizing information, weaponizing facts to use to beat the other side into submission, but rather we should be having a dialogue, right? The last thing this nation needs is some new kind of civil war. We went through that once in our history to resolve the issue of slavery. And we can hope that we never would even come close to such a situation again. But the divergence of opinion is being crystallized today around issues like this Roe v. Wade decision. So Daniel, any last comments on what you've experienced here on the show today and what we're trying to do here with the Created in the Image of God podcast live stream? Any words of advice or parting comments around what we're doing here?
Yeah, I'd love to come back. I think your show has been great for the hour that I've been able to be here for, and I think let's just see how it evolves. I mean, you did it. I did it, right? Right.
Daniel, what a pleasure. It's we've had several conversations in the last couple of weeks around you joining the show, and I've missed our dialogues that we had some time ago. So I'm really glad we're back on that, and hopefully our audience is liking it as well. So for those of you who tuned in tonight, subscribe, like. This is recorded. It will be posted. It's on our YouTube channel for Something or Other Publishing. We also have the Baha'is of Clearwater hosting it on Facebook. As we expand this, we plan to populate it out to other channels as well as doing some marketing to grow the audience. So Daniel Sanderson, founder of Planksip, philosopher, mathematician, formerly, I don't know, you were probably never an architect yourself, but working in that field, data computer guy, might say Renaissance man, jack of all trades. Really a pleasure to have you on the show. Can't wait to do this again.
Thanks, Wade.